Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon from wherever you're joining us in the world today. And welcome to another episode of the Realist Lens for researchers who keep it real. Realist evaluation and synthesis have grown significantly in recent years, becoming a popular approach in the research toolkit for understanding programs, interventions, and complex phenomena across a range of fields. One of the most important developments during this time has been the creation of the realist and meta-narrative evidence synthesis evolving standards, better known as RAMESES. These standards have helped shape the field by offering training resources, quality benchmarks, and publication guidelines for researchers, evaluations, and commissioners alike. But how were they developed? What lies ahead for their continued evolution? And what are some of the key points that you should know about these standards in your realist journey? To explore these questions, I'm joined today by a very special guest who has played a central role in both realist evaluation and the development of the RAMSES standards as part of the core team, Joanne Greenhalgh. Joanne, how are you? Good morning.
Good, thanks. Thanks for inviting me on.
Absolutely, no problem at all. I'm really excited to talk to you about this topic because this is certainly something that I really enjoyed when I first got involved in the realist evaluation and synthesis, which is learning about these standards and having a guide. And I don't want to call it a prescription because I think with the iterative nature of the project, there's no one way to do a realist evaluation or synthesis, but this guide and this North Star that becomes these standards can become super useful. And I'm really looking forward to talk to you a little bit more about the process and how it went. Just before we get started, Joanne, just for those who may have who may have started their journey recently and then they want to hear a little bit more about your work and your role in the realist community so far, would you just mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, I'm Joanne Greenhalgh. I am a professor of applied social research methodology in the School of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Leeds. So I guess my work has focused on methodological development. So I think I first became interested in realist research or realist methods when I was a long, long time ago, back in 2004, when I was trying to review or understand an intervention that not many people, other people in this, well, people in a certain field are interested in it, but not everyone. It's on patient-reported outcome measures, and I was frustrated by the fact that there were systematic reviews, but they didn't seem to explain how or why this intervention worked. It was so heterogeneous, so complex. So that's when my then kind of mentor, PhD supervisor, Andrew Long, suggested I look at realist methods. And luckily enough, Ray worked at Leeds as well, which is where I was. So I remember going to see him and he was very helpful. And I did a sort of, it was an attempt at a realist explanation and analysis of that. And then later on, I met Ray in a sandwich shop opposite the university, and he said, "There's a job going. Why don't you apply?" So I did, and I got the job and started working with Ray, and that's when I also met Anna. A project to, I guess, promote, spread, apply the use of realist methods in health. So yeah, then I worked with Ray and learned a lot from working alongside him.
I'm sure you did. That is fantastic, and I love the sandwich
Yeah.
serendipity. That is
Yes.
fantastic.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you share there is so interesting because I think a lot of people that come to realist research come from initially those frustrations that they initially feel from either one way, so yeah, more positivist way, as you say,
Mhm.
more traditional linear way of seeing the world, or indeed the other extreme of constructivism. So it's really interesting to hear how you came across to that. And of course, you met some very important people to help you in that process.
Mhm.
Just, I'm interested to hear, John, because obviously the first Ramses standards get published in 2013. So that's
Mhm.
Ramses 1. And
Yes.
then we have Ramses 2 in 2016. But you
Mhm.
say that you started in 2004. So from 2004 till those standards get first developed, how did you manage with doing realist work? And I know you had some fantastic supervision, but before the standards, did you find that it was a little bit more difficult to develop realist work or realist evaluations within the work that you were doing?
I guess so. I mean, obviously Ray's written uh, a lot of books. There's the 1997 book on realistic evaluation. So they later dropped the ick at the end with Pawson and Tilley. And then in 2006, Ray wrote Realist. Sorry, I forgot what it's called now. It's on my shelf. I know what it's, but the Realist Review or Evidence-Based Policy, a Realist Manifesto. And then, so when I started working with him, he was just finalising his third book, which was really interesting to see how that process works. And I guess it was just looking at examples of Ray's work, really, because there were a few people who were interested in that approach and had done things. But yeah, I would say probably around the 2011, 2012, 2013. That's when it really started to take off, and more people started applying realist methods.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess you were in that special position, right, to be working with with Ray to have that
Yes,
guidance in that
yes.
progress. But I guess a lot of people, as you said, were probably going through a similar procedure, which is reading that work, or maybe potentially other realist evaluations being attempted at the time,
Hmm.
but probably we probably saw at that time is it's realist work being done, but not necessarily fully following a realist principle, or realist methods or approaches. So when it comes to the analysis and etc. So when you say 2011, 2012, there is a more demand, so to speak, for these approaches. Was that what initially instigated the Ramses standards and publications to be created?
I think so. I mean, obviously, I wasn't involved in the initial, but I was sort of watching it from afar, and I think it was about the. I mean, it's a learning process, isn't it? And I think so Ray and Trish and Jeff and Anna and we've all been at pains to say that we learn alongside other people. We learn from other people. Hopefully, you learn from us, and we learn from you. It's a very kind of it's a dialogue. And I think that's also why they were very keen to call it evolving standards, to sort of recognize that the field changes, that new developments happen, new ideas happen. A method or a methodology, as realist methodology is, it doesn't necessarily stand still, but there are some probably core fundamental features that it's helpful to communicate in a very clear way and say, this is what a good realist review or a good realist evaluation should look like, and to set those out in a clear way, almost like as a marker in the sand, to say, yeah, not to impose a standardization, but to say, this is what good looks like.
I love that, Joanne. That's, as you mentioned, guidance and not prescription,
Mm.
particularly for people to follow this way of thinking, because that is
Yeah,
one of the things that I really encourage people when I introduce them to realist work, that it's a way of thinking. It's not like a formula as
yeah.
such. And that's what I find really useful from the approach, and also the standards per se. And evolving, I love that as well, evolving standards, because it does mention as well, like the realist thinking, that no theory is like the final theory or the final thing. It's always developing, it's always
Mm,
evolving, a little bit like the swamp metaphor that Popper uses. Um, you mentioned just there, Joanne, about some of the key ideas that of what
mm.
good looks like. So based on the standards, the ones that you worked on, for instance, or realist evaluation as well, what does good look like? If someone were to read the Ramsey standards, which of course I'll highly encourage them to do so, what are some of the key areas that a good realist evaluation looks like? What are some of those key processes?
I think it's that the study or the approach is based on a realist understanding of the world, and that its foundations are in this idea of generative causation rather than a successionist understanding of the world, where all you need to do, it's very difficult to do, but is create a closed system and rule out alternative explanations of an association between two variables. If you've got that, then you can say variable A causes variable B. And I think it's more an understanding that actually what we really need to understand is the sort of generative mechanisms, understanding underlying causation, and a recognition that these vary depending on the context, that this idea that context is the thing that shapes the mechanisms through which an intervention works and produces outcomes. So I think that kind of thinking, which leads to all sorts of, I guess, ways and approaches of doing research. And I guess a fundamental one is this idea of, theories and theory testing. And I remember when I first met Ray, one of the questions I said, well, what do you mean by theory? What do because my background initially was in psychology. So it's like, do you mean substantive theories? And he's like, well, yes, you can use those, but that's not often where you start. You often start with the kind of very basic, almost simple ideas and assumptions of how is this intervention intended to work? What are the ways in which it's intended to change behavior, reasoning, attitudes, or whatever? Then trying to think about, well, how might those vary depending on contextual features? And these aren't just, I guess, characteristics. They're often more relational. They're often the unwritten rules of how an organization works. As Anna and I talked about in our paper there, they're dynamic, they're evolving, they're not kind of static features of people's, age, gender. It's like, what is it about age and gender that actually make a difference to how this intervention works? So I think it's kind of recognizing that thinking, as you say, is a way of thinking, and that means that certain tools are useful. So I think a really important paper was Anna's paper on doing the realist interview. Obviously, that built on Ray's initial paper a long time ago, back in 1996. But I think that was a really important tool to sort of explain this kind of teacher-learner idea of putting the theories in a way that your participants will understand and can relate to, and asking them to teach you. So, you are a teacher and a learner in the interview. Both participants play those roles.
Mm.
Sorry, I feel I've
And
wandered off there, but I think it's that fundamental sort of theory testing, this idea. And I think a really important thing is to recognize that it's a context mechanism outcome configuration, that, that we always think of mechanisms in relation to context. So what is it about the context that makes this mechanism more or less likely to happen and produce outcomes?
thanks, John. I love that last point of avoiding like an IKEA catalog of things, and really making a link of things that are
Yes.
going together between what the actual contents of mechanism interaction to produce that outcome. And what you mentioned there is so interesting as I hear you speak, is obviously from your journey as well with realist approaches. You've seen the development of the standards, all these methodological
Hmm.
papers coming
Hmm.
coming along. So so you have the interview with Anna that you've mentioned. You have the one that you've mentioned around context as well, which is super fascinating. Justin has written about retroductive theorizing.
Hmm.
Now there's people talking around stakeholder involvement and
Yeah.
stakeholder
Yeah.
interventions and analysis and analytical strategies.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it feels like since the standards were developed as well, it seems like it's also had a propelling effect, and it's hard to put into measure in a way, but it does seem like since 2013 2016, over the last 10 years,
Mhm.
these approaches have really gone up. I don't know if you would agree with that observation.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and there's obviously Sonia's paper on the mechanism, which I think was really important. That was developed out of her PhD. It was a great paper. But I think maybe why people find it useful and interesting is that it sort of opens up the black box of how interventions work. There's much more emphasis now on recognition of the sort of complex intervention evaluation. So obviously, the MRC has been revising its guidance on the evaluation of complex interventions over the years. And I remember when was it about 2008 when the first one, maybe even before that, it came out. Um, and there's been several revisions of that, and the latest revision has got a very kind of realist, like, recognition of the importance of program theory and testing. I think that's really important. So I think partly it's maybe, hopefully, it's usefulness in the field, that's driven people. I think also certain funders also find it useful, I think, which has helped. And then, of course, as people publish things, that creates a community, creates a dialogue. So I think that's also really helpful. I mean, I think it's really useful, and it's not appropriate in all situations. I know there's been criticisms, and I think that's also a really healthy thing to have that dialogue and that sort of criticism, and that helps you think, of, well, okay, I think that's, as long as it's constructive and collegial and respectful, which in all the situations it has been. So I think that's, yeah, I think that's
So
helpful.
I certainly agree, John. I think that through I mean, Ray in his last book uses the term organized skepticism as well,
Yes.
which is interesting. So it reminds me a little bit of that we are talking about, which is criticizing and pushing each other to help science evolve and advance, which
Yeah.
I think that is one of the key
Yeah.
areas. Um, Going back to some of the standards, because I think exactly what you mean, and all these publications and everything now, they cite the Ramsey standards. I mean,
Yeah.
there's lots of citations now for both
Yes.
Ramsey's 1 for realist synthesis and also Ramsey's 2, which is
Yes.
the realist evaluation.
Yeah.
And I guess that one of the risks that we have as a community, particularly with individuals using the standards, is that sometimes people just cite to say, "Oh, I've cited this, so therefore it must
Mm.
be good," but then you may go and see that they haven't been probably fully followed. So
Yeah.
beyond citation and beyond just citing the work, how do you feel that researchers can meaningfully engage with these standards in their work? And what does that look like when it's done well? Should people read? So before an evaluation, throughout the evaluation or synthesis, what should people really do when it comes to engaging with the standards? So to not only be a tick in the box
Yeah.
tokenistic, I've cited it, but actually engaging and learning in the process as well.
Well, I think one of the important things that some people, don't always realize is that there are quality standards and reporting standards, and they're slightly different. So sometimes, yeah, sometimes just people confuse those two. The reporting standards is how you report what you've done, but the quality standards are much more about, well, how do you do a realist evaluation? And they're very flexible. They're not, as you say, a recipe and a prescription. And I think it's down to teams to have that dialogue with each other and to question what they're doing and to really think. And that takes time. I think, often I've worked in a number of teams where I've been there, and I'm putting my fingers up in the air, and the realist expert. And I think if I'm really honest, it varies as to how much the team want to embrace that method. And I think it's an education for the team, I think, and for me to learn from the team. So often maybe I'm in helping areas where I don't know much of the substantive topic area, but I kind of have to, I've learned about that. So for example, I recently did a review in the area of youth justice, which is very new to me. But now I've learned a lot about the youth justice, and I like to think that the youth justice researchers have also learned a lot about realist methods, which I think if you ask them, they'd say they would. But so that was a really productive collaboration because we listened to each other. I think. And I think collectively solving problems and thinking, and also thinking about it the whole way through. So I think, not just thinking about it at the beginning, but it's something that you have to think about the whole way through. So from your decisions about, identifying the theories, and if you're doing an evaluation, who you speak to, what data you collect, your sampling, your analysis, it's something that you weave in the whole way through. So not something that you just, you know, think about at the end. I mean, I've spoken to many statisticians in my time, and they bemoan the same thing, that the wrong time is at the end to get a statistician in. You need them in at the beginning. So I would say it's the same kind of idea.
I love that, John, what you mentioned there, that the realist thinking starts from the moment you're thinking around conceptualization of the project and the research question, because that impacts the questions that you're asking. And then obviously if you're doing a realist synthesis, how the search strategy goes, and the
Yeah.
kind of inclusion and exclusion criteria for an evaluation, the kind of, this method neutral way of testing theories. So I think that's fascinating. And also that collaboration, because I find it interesting that you say around the variation of people embracing the approach, because some people
Mhm.
will find it initially super interesting, but some particularly and not in anyone's fault, if you
No.
have been trained and thought
Yeah.
in a certain way, then
Yeah.
thinking about, thinking around these things that we can't observe when all I do is observe changes and outcomes, that may seem a little bit frightening to some people.
Yeah.
So drawing from that experience, how do you help people embrace the realist approach, and have those Ramsey standards helped? So, have you referred them to the standards? So I'm thinking about particularly for those PhD students maybe who have supervisors who maybe are not realists, or I'm
Mm.
also thinking about in your position in collaborations where people are initially starting with realist approach. I guess is how have you um, navigated those situations where there's been a mismatch, and if the standards have helped you as well, as a resource and a tool to help people get on board.
Yeah, I mean, I've been lucky. I've had some great collaborators. I've enjoyed working with all the people, and it's been very productive. And yeah, that's been great. And I think, yeah, I've had PhD students as well and some of them have come out of the PhD saying, "I never want to do that again." Some of them have come out thinking, "This is great." I almost like they feel like they've found their home. So I think, I've had both experiences, and that's fine, but both of them are fine. I think the standards have been useful as a starting point, almost like as a sort of a benchmark, as a kind of foundation. But I think you you would still need to have the conversations. Okay, what does this mean in practice? What does this mean for my program or for my program theory or for my project? So one of the things, Anna and I, we run the module that Ray used to run on program and policy evaluation, and an exercise that students have to do is to design an evaluation. And I always say to them, we don't just want a generic account of a process evaluation or a realist evaluation. What we need to understand is how this applies to your particular program. So, while the standards I think are useful as a grounding for that, I still think you need to have that thinking of, okay, well, how do I operationalize this for my program? How do I do that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really useful, Joanne, because as we mentioned, as not being a prescription, it has that flexibility to fit
Mm,
within the program. So if you embrace the ideas, the way of thinking, and what it's trying to do, then in that intervention program phenomena of study, then it's probably going to be, it can be molded in that way, as long as
mm,
the key foundations that we spoke about in one of the previous episodes as well, talking around the ontology and epistemology and the realist lens, like the name of
mm,
the podcast, certainly is useful. And I think that's, as you say, as a starting point for people to understand what to expect, at least from from realist work, and again, particularly for those who are just starting. And we have here, it's been nearly, so it was 2016. So you did this work
mm.
published, and we are getting some more, evolution in the approach, some more analysis approaches are coming. We also have, I know there's a group working on the standards of realist economic evaluation, for
Yes.
instance, in
Yes.
Northumbria with
Hmm.
Sonia Dalkin and Angela
Yeah.
Bates. So there's a
Yeah.
lot of, again, progression that is happening. So what updates or refinements do you see for the Ramsey standards as evolving standards? Do you feel that they're going to be updated at some point? And if so, what are some of the areas that you feel that the current standards um, don't necessarily see from what we know now in the realist approach? Is anything missing?
Well, yeah, I think the economic evaluation element is really important. I think Sonia and Angela's project is really really important. I think it's great that they're taking this plunge of bringing two groups who might not normally talk to each other. I'm on the steering group for that, and the conversations have been incredible. Just at the steering group meetings, they've been just places where I've learned so much. And I think the economy, everybody seems to be learning. And I like the pragmatic approach that they're taking in the project, and not letting perfect be the enemy of the good. It's like, okay, we're never gonna, maybe there are some things that we're never gonna meet on, but actually, can we find a way forward? Because economic evaluation is a sort of reality. It's really important in terms of changing policy, in terms of making policy decisions. And I think one of the sort of criticisms, to some extent, of the findings of some realist evaluations is that they don't give policymakers a single answer. Well, that's not, in a way that's not their own. They're saying, well, actually, you need to adapt the program to the context, but I think that project is going to be really important. And I also think the way that they have, put initial guidelines or, initial things out and let people comment on it. I think that's a really inclusive and collegiate approach to developing the ideas. So I think, yeah, I think it's a great project, and I'll be really interested to see how that comes out. I mean, I'm sure that these things get updated, like Cochrane reviews. They get updated. Things get up. I'm sure eventually the RAMESES will be updated. It will be great to see the next generation of realist researchers do that. I'm not yet ready for retirement, but it's on. But I think that's what's nice. I think it's really, this is why I think PhD students are also really important and such a great asset, because not to quote Whitney Houston too much, but they're they're the future. And that's how a community grows. So I think it's really important to nurture our early career researchers, PhDs, students. And I think that's what I like about the RAMESES JISC list. I don't comment on there as often as I would like to. I'm just so busy, but I get the sense that that is a very supportive and a nice, arena for people to ask questions. And there's no such thing as a silly question. You people can ask questions on there and they'll get some advice. So I think that's also kind of really important. I think it's just, yeah, important to recognize that we're all learning. That, I've been okay, yeah, I've been doing this for a while, but I still learn from all my students. I'm not, I'm very happy to be made to think and to change my view and to go, oh, okay, yeah, I never thought about that. I think that's really important.
You mentioned a couple of real key nuggets, as Pawson would say there, which I'd like to just touch on, which is that point that you say at the end. One of the favorite quotes that I remind myself every single day is, "I only know that I know nothing,"
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that really helps me in that curiosity. So it's really great to hear that thought and that mindset as well. That regardless of of the experience and the years and the publications, there's still something to learn. There's still something new, and that's fantastic. And that's
mm,
so I'm really happy to hear those thoughts. And also what you mentioned there around the policymakers, not being a criticism of, because it is the really slogan of it depends, and you're not
yeah,
going to get a yes or no answer. And I guess that when people are looking at the realist standards and the Ramsey standards as well, is to also understand that the outcome is not linear and the
mm,
answer is not a yes or no. So when you're looking at a Ramsey standards, it's also going into there with a open mind, as you say, with
yeah,
the curiosity and
mm,
with the wanting to learn a different approach of seeing the world.
mm,
Which again in other sciences is quite common, but particularly as you say, for example, I think it would have been fascinating talking to some health economists, for instance, and then some realists coming
yeah.
together.
It was wonderful. I mean, and yeah, that was great. And also, but just thinking about policymakers, I think also I am very aware as a researcher that I don't have as full a picture of the kind of environment that makers work in. Anna's just finished a fellowship where she's been working for the Department for the Economy in Northern Ireland, and I'm sure she mentioned that. But that, to understand the kind of context in which they work, and so what they need in terms to inform their decisions. So I think, like talking, it's about a meeting of minds. It's a dialogue. It's okay. How can I help you? What's the best way of doing that? And as researchers, sometimes we're not always good at doing that. Partly because we're so busy that and partly because the way that we're rewarded, it doesn't always align with that engagement. Although I think that's massively changing now,
Yeah.
with changes to the kind of research, the ref, which is good. But all these things take time. I think that's the other kind of elephant in the room, isn't it, in terms of doing anything. We talk about needing to have a dialogue within a team, have a dialogue with the economists, dialogue with policymakers. That all that stuff takes time.
Certainly, and it's as we mentioned, slowly but surely. There is one thing that you mentioned just before as well, John, which is the Ramsey's JISC list, and I just want to
Mm.
also highlight to listeners the differences between the Ramsey's standards and the Ramsey's JISC list, because some people who may be listening to this for the first time is like, there's two
Oh yeah.
Ramsey's things. So you have the Ramsey's project, so you have
Yes.
Ramsey's 1 and 2, and there's a
Hmm.
website for that,
There
and
is.
those are
Yeah.
the the publication standards, right? Publication
Yes.
quality standards, training materials, and
Yeah.
it's the projects that you've been talking about, but also the gist list, which is
Hmm.
basically if you're interested in realist evaluation, realist synthesis, realist research, in this list, every basically realist researcher that knows about it is in that list, and they share
Hmm.
ideas and comments.
Hmm.
And one of the things that you mentioned is how open the community is, and I completely agree. How people are so willing to share, so willing to help,
Hmm.
like with open arms, and that makes it
Hmm.
such a nice open. And honestly, as a young early career researcher myself in mental health, doing my PhD, I feel so one of the you feel so welcome, and
Hmm.
it's such a nice environment. So I completely
Yeah.
agree with what you said there.
Good. Yeah, that's good. The other thing about the RAMESES project that Anna and I really enjoyed. We enjoyed writing the little 1,000 word summary of various things, and they're obviously on the website. But the other thing that was almost like something that we did towards the end was working with the cartoonist Chris Lissy on Fresh Spectrum. So he's got this very strange Venn diagram of skills, which is an evaluator and an illustrator, cartoonist. Yeah, not many people like that around, but he was wonderful to work with. And again, that was all a dialogue of how can we find a fun, innovative way of trying to capture some of these realist concepts in a way that people will understand and make them laugh at the same time, hopefully. Um, but again, they're all on the RAMESES Project's websites as well, and we've seen those used in, they're free to use, they're little cartoons. We've seen those used in so many presentations, and it's a delight to see. And yeah, I try and use them in my own work, but they're good.
It's definitely got a chuckle or two from me, Joanne. I do like those those illustrations. They're certainly, as you say, like this podcast and like other, it's around making the research accessible and the ideas
Mm,
accessible and engaging in order for not just to be an academic exercise, but also a way of thinking for the world. As we get to the end of our conversation, Joanne, which I've really enjoyed hearing about you and your thoughts and the energy that you bring to this is fantastic. And also your learning progress as well, as you say, continuously learning. And again, I find that fantastic. Over all your experience and over doing the Ramsey standards as well, um, you will have seen a lot of successes. You will have seen a lot of
mm,
learnings as well.
mm.
So do you have any top tips for those individuals who are engaging with realist work for the first time, potentially, or that they're reading the Ramsey standards for the first time, or they're just interested in the Ramsey standards and how they're evolving? What would be your top three pieces of advice for someone, either in how to use them, interpret them, or find value in order to get started or indeed check that the realist work is indeed realist?
Well, that's tricky. I think I think my biggest inclination is just to provide some words of reassurance to people when they first try and engage with this, because it can feel overwhelming, particularly at the beginning when you are maybe trying to develop your program theories and your initial ideas. They can seem to proliferate at an enormous rate. And that lots of people like Jeff and Ray and Trish have all talked about being in the swamp at the beginning. And I think just to reiterate that that's normal, that don't panic. It's usual to feel overwhelmed at the beginning when you've got all these, program theories that you will, and I think for me also one of the things that I really learned from Ray was this process of um going up and down this ladder of abstraction between your kind of, the program in front of you that is often very specific, and you've got some very tightly, millions. This is where you end up with a proliferation of program theories. You've often got loads, but then going up this ladder as to say, what kind of program is this? And I think last week, or was it a couple of weeks ago? Jeff said, actually, there's only ever, three main program theories. It sticks, sermons and carrots. Often program theories involve, or programs involve one or more of those things, telling people what to do, threatening sanctions on people if they don't do what they're told, and rewarding people, So you can usually find those elements. But I think what really helped me see my way through the swamp was thinking, what's this an example of? And how can I somehow try and see the wood for the trees? So, you often start down in the trees and you've got all these program theories, but try to see what the wood looks like. Try and get above those and see how these millions of program theories actually they probably all cluster around a number of key ideas. And I think the other thing is not to get too bogged down, at least initially, in labeling things as C's and M's and O's, and recognize that you'll have fragments of those. But I think always trying to remember that it's not just about the mechanisms. I think one of the things you think, oh yeah, but actually mechanisms are, inextricably linked to context. So I think the key thing I would say is, as you say, making sure you're not just doing a catalogue of context, catalogue of mechanism, catalogue of outcomes. It's trying to think about how they're connected. So I don't know whether that's three. I've kind of rambled a little bit there, but I think that's really important. And just, just going with it and just saying, okay, this is how it is. It is a bit scary in the same way that I say to all my PhD students and master's students, it's a roller coaster. There'll be times when it's really clear and there'll be other times when you think, I don't know what's going on. I still feel like that sometimes at the beginning of a realist project. It's completely normal. I think the more you do it, the more you can sit with that uncertainty and not get alarmed with it and trust that you're gonna find a way through. I remember, learning that from Ray. He was like, "Yeah, yeah, this is normal." I'm like, "Yeah, but we've got a project to do, we've got a deadline." He's like, "Yeah, don't worry, it'll," and indeed it did. But there may be times when you've got to go, "Okay, really, we had to abandon one path we were going down to say guidelines, when we were looking at that. It's too big, we can't take that approach. We've got to do another way." And indeed, we found a different way through that. So yeah, just having, having faith in the process.
I love that, Joanne. As a summary, you got number one, reassurance and trust the process. Number two, going up and down that abstraction from the
Mm,
granular, CMO configuration theories from the program to a more middle range. So that
yeah,
abstraction with
yeah,
examples. And then to make sure that as you're doing your projects, to think in configurations. So not to
yes,
just catalog, but to ensure that all those that domino effect, so to speak, is seen at all moments.
yeah,
And I think those are three really useful tips
yeah,
and really helpful for listeners to just after this conversation to keep going in their projects and that everything will be okay.
yeah,
Joanne, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you in the Realist Lens. Thank you so much for your time, for sharing your stories, your ideas, how the Ramses standards evolved and some of the key ideas through that as well, and also for sharing some of those tips for individuals who may be in their projects. And for anyone listening, thank you so much for being in another episode of the Realist Lens, and I'm sure I'll see you soon. Joanne, thank you so much.
thank you.